Okay, so I'm going through Jordan Peterson's Resurrection, Death and Resurrection of Christ in 5 parts video. I did a video on part 1. Part 1, he's pretty much into prolegomena. He reads from maps of meaning. He talks about the nested world between the material world of objects and the platform of being, where there are I'll just pull up my usual slide for that. The platform of being, where we see tools, where story governs stuff, where there's hierarchies in play. I didn't talk about hierarchies actually, but this is this realm of action. And we don't have, he talks about the fact that we don't have the boundary line between these worlds, despite my hard black line. We don't have the boundary line between these worlds sufficiently figured out. And that partly gets into this drawing, which I've used before, where you have the revenge of the materialists. The materialists say, but your being is standing upon material, and so Peterson would say, yeah, we don't know the boundaries of this, and so this is part of our difficulty. And another piece of the difficulty is that the religious and the material have been divorced, and we don't know how to put them together. And part of the problem with this is that the stories that we are dependent on come from before the divorce. And we're not going to simply go back before the divorce, because we can't not see what we see now, and we can't not know what we know now. So we're up to the second part of his 5-part series, some axioms of the Christian revolutionary story. Now, again, if you go just behind, he introduced in a sense, drawing out and mapping out, in a sense, the hero story, where you descend into chaos and then you come out a new person. And I mentioned that, okay, I can go with him that the resurrection story is, you can understand the resurrection story as a story of that type. But does that exhaust the resurrection story? And I think he would say, no, it doesn't. But okay, well, how? Well, let's see. At the danger of me redoing my last video, let's just jump in here.
2. Some axioms of the Christian revolutionary story. Number 1. To decide that and then enact the proposition that being is good despite its tragedy and malevolence. Number 2. To work in consequence for the continual and eternal improvement of that being, and to know that as love.
Okay, now these are really important points for Peterson, and I know this frustrates some of you. All these videos for me are me thinking out loud. I'm trying to process this stuff, and I'm also reading Alan Jacobs' book, How to Think. And Peterson and Jacobs make a lot of parallel points in a lot of ways, because, what is thinking? Thinking is, in the sense, having a conversation within our head. Well, part of what I'm doing on YouTube is having a conversation with all you, and you're writing comments and so on and so forth. So we're having this conversation together. And I just actually thought of the fact that every time as a society we have this habit of saying, we need to have a conversation about this. In a sense, what we're saying is we need to think about this. Unfortunately, a lot of the things that people say, we need to have a conversation about this, they don't really mean we need to have a conversation about this. We mean, I need to tell you what you should do. So anyway, but these first 2 points are really important for Peterson, because when you get into his talking about the guys who shot up Columbine High School and that whole group, the group of people that decide that being isn't good. And I think as a Christian, you get into Genesis 1, and God creates order out of chaos, and it is good, it is good, it is good, it is good, it is very good. And being is good. And so life is pain, but life is worth the living. To work in consequence for the continual and eternal improvement of that being, and to know that as love. Some people have said to me, it's kind of missing in Peterson is love, and that's an important observation as Christians, because for Christianity, if the cardinal sin is pride, the cardinal virtue is charity or love. And the reason, at least in Old English, they prefer charity to love is charity tends to have within it the aspect of agape, of self-giving love. And people sometimes complain to me that Peterson doesn't have enough love in his message. There's more duty there. To work in consequence for the continual and eternal improvement of that being, and to know that it is love. It's very similar to his Melbourne address, where he tries to get into some of this too. So it's interesting that love is back in it.
Number 3, to do such work in truth.
Now again, remember, Peterson's concept of truth is not simply material verification, which tends to be a materialist definition of truth. Peterson's definition of truth is bigger. Now, it's hard to know just with this, because his definition of truth sometimes includes the pragmatism. But if you listen to enough Peterson, you know, just he's a human being, just like the rest of us, and words are hard. What do you mean by truth? This is an important word here.
Number 4, to let everything inadequate burn off in that pursuit, and to welcome its replacement by what is better.
Okay, and that maybe helps contextualize the truth, because now we're more into this Peterson's idea of, say, lying pastors, of the fact that we use language manipulatively. We and so then he has this other theme that he engages often, where, you know, we need to be our stuff needs to be burned away to reveal, in a sense, to reveal who we truly are, and or better yet, to let truth out, to get rid of the crust, so that we can, let's say, if we're using a metaphor like that, we can move in freedom, the scabs fall off.
Number 5, to know that as the sacred imitation of Christ.
Well, now we're getting somewhere, because now we're very much into, oh, this stuff is so hard. We're very much into the imitation of Christ. In what way? Because there's a moral layer to that, and in a sense you ask, well, which part of Christ's story ought I to imitate it? Well, you say, well, the whole story. Okay, I can't do the incarnation necessarily. Well, I suppose you can. We have incarnational ministry. It's a term that we use in Christian missions. Oh boy, this is complicated. To know that as the sacred imitation of Christ. And sometimes, so after my conversation with Peterson, a bunch of people jumped on Peterson's use of the divine individual. Now, when people ask me about that, I'll often say, well, you have to understand that if you're deep within the Christian tradition, you're very careful about how you use that word divine. If you're not deep within the Christian tradition, you're not necessarily that careful about how you use the word divine. Christians and I would assume Jews and Muslims will be very cautious how they use the word divine. In vernacular contemporary speech, people are quite incautious in how they use the word divine. So we're knocking on that door in number 5. But again, if you look at Peterson's part 1 of this, the prolegomena, we're in the realm of being. We're in the realm of action. We're within which material is nested. Now, this is going to get important as we try to answer the questions. Within how many frames is the resurrection active? How far down does it go? Well, let's keep going.
Number 6, to understand that although Christ's sacrifice redeemed us all, the work still has to be done.
And again, if you go back and you watch Ron Dart's latest on Peterson, I think Dart handles this quite well. in my tradition, and those of you who watch my sermons know that I conclude most of my sermons with misery, deliverance, gratitude. And this is the framework of the Heidelberg Catechism. And I do so because part of what we all wrestle with is this relationship between God's action and our action. And I think the best way to frame it is misery. This is our fallen, broken, insufficient state. Deliverance, the action that God does on our behalf, and then gratitude, what we must do. Tim Keller uses an old clergy phrase. We are, faith that saves us is not alone. The Heidelberg Catechism talks about that. Once God's grace works upon us, it can't help but bear fruit. And all of this is an attempt to language the relationship between God's action and our action. And even if you get into C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, I often can't find that section in Mere Christianity where Lewis talks about this. But that's a tremendously difficult thing for us to talk about. I think partly because of the constraints of what consciousness is. Consciousness is in itself its own monarchical vision. We have a very difficult time holding two things together in our heads. We have even a nearly impossible time holding three or more things together inside our heads. At two, we can with this idea of tension or paradox or balance. These are all words that we try to do to hold two things at once. But God's action and our action. And so now Peterson is not a theologian. And that's important to remember in this, because theologians spend all their time trying to get the language right, and then a whole tradition arises around theology to try to get the language right. And that's why when a friend of mine I'm a pastor, not really a theologian, I do theology, but I'm a pastor, we're practitioners. So when I was talking to a friend of mine who's a very legitimate, well-established theologian, and he watched my interview with Peterson, the first thing out of his mouth was, this divine individual, I didn't like that. Well, of course you didn't like that. You're a theologian. You're a theologian in the Christian Reformed Church. You're a Reformed theologian. You put those words together, it's like magnets. No, they don't go together. Jesus is the divine. Well, see, if you say Jesus is the divine individual, then you run into Trinitarian language. So theologians are keeping all of this up to date. Now, if I were to talk to Jordan Peterson about psychology, me as a pastor, I would say something inappropriate. I would say something that a PhD in psychology would bristle at. So I'd never say it that way. Now, he's also a practitioner, so he'd probably mask his bristling and say, well, I'd probably say it this way. And this is what pastors do. People come in and they say things that are theologically way off base, and the wise pastor doesn't jump down their throat and correct them, but says, well, I might say something a little different. So you got to give them some slack. So to understand that although Christ's sacrifice redeems us all, the work still has to be done. And even that redeems us all, you have some of the universalistic texts of the Bible that theology has dealt with. This is all hard stuff.
Number 7, to accept that work as the sacred meaning of life.
Now, that might be the most Christian thing in this list. That's pretty dramatic. He doesn't say to accept that work as a sacred meaning of life, but as the sacred meaning of life. That's pretty monarchical.
Number 8, to strive toward the heavenly city on the hill in that manner.
So, Winthrop City on a hill. A lot of hills, a lot of cities on the hill. Jerusalem is the highest mountain in the Bible, even though Jerusalem is 2,300 feet tall. You have to understand how symbolic language works. The heavenly city, and again, as a theologian, you look at this language, and say, okay, let's play.
Part 3.
Oh, that's pretty quick. So I have to decide if I want to wrap it up here at part 2. Maybe just for the sense of order, I will. But that list is a really important list. Come on, you can do it. That list he has here is pretty important to decide that, and then enact the proposition that being is good. This is a really interesting list, and I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about this list because I don't know that I've seen this list before. And so this list might actually be the newest and most significant thing in this video. And it's less than a minute. I'm going to have to do a lot more thinking about this because I think actually this list is pretty important, and I think this list might be in some ways the clearest articulation of Peterson's theology that we've seen in such a succinct format. Now there's 8 points. Should be 7 or 10. Yeah, so maybe I will leave it at there, and just because I'm going to have to think a lot more about this.